Diablo 4 launched with a certain design pattern that has to do with how you augment your character's gear with special powers that I think was so awful that it's the root cause of why so many players were soured on the game as they got more into it. But the good news is that after 3 seasons of misery about the way this feature works, the issue is completely solved in the game's Season 4. I'm going to tell you what this problem is, how it ever got this way in the first place, why it's so bad, and what the fix is. The issue here is about legendary aspects, which is kind of a stupid name for special abilities. In Diablo 4, your character has many different types of gear that it can wear, such as helmets and gloves, chest piece, and so on. There's about 10 of those, depending on which class you're playing, and each of the 10 can have one legendary aspect or one special ability applied to it. Here's an example. Let's say you have some gloves, and the stats on those gloves, which are all random, by the way, they happen to be pretty good and they're kind of what you want. And then another pair of gloves drops, and as is the more than 99% case, those gloves are going to be garbage because they don't have exactly the stats you want or the right rolls or whatever. But this new set of gloves has a legendary aspect applied to it that you do want. Can you somehow combine the gloves you're already wearing that have stats that you want with this new special power that's on the other gloves? And the good news is the answer is yes. You can extract the aspect from the new gloves and then you can apply it to your current gloves. So far, that sounds really good. This is part of building your character, of creating a build. So your build consists partly of the 6 abilities that are your active ones, where you actually have to click a button to do them, and also partly from all of these aspects that you apply to your gear. So as you go through the game and get more different aspects available to you, you're choosing which ones to apply to your gear, and that's your build. But what happens when yet another pair of gloves drops and those gloves have much better stats than your current gloves? Can you extract the aspect on your current gloves and then transfer it to those new gloves? And the answer is, unfortunately, no. You can only extract and imprint a given aspect one time. And I already did that once in my example. So if I want to put the same kind of aspect on my new better stats gloves, I have to find an item in the world somewhere that has another copy of this aspect so I can extract it from that and put it on the new gloves. Why does it work that way though? This is how Diablo 4 launched. That's how it worked. So why did the designers decide to make it this way? And although they haven't said out loud exactly why, I think it's pretty obvious why. The reason is that if the alternative was true, if you found a drop of a certain aspect and then you extracted it, and then from then on, for the rest of the game, you could apply that to any new piece of gear that you find, then they were worried that you would care less and less about new loot over the course of the game. And that concern makes sense. If there's a certain aspect that buffs your meteor spell or something and you get it once, then they're worried that for the rest of the game, for hundreds of hours, that any drops of that meteor aspect you don't care about anymore. And over time, more and more things would pile up that you don't care about, and eventually there just wouldn't be enough loot to sustain the game. I mean, that was the worry, at least. What I think probably happened is that they thought about it and then decided that it's basically a given that players can't be allowed to imprint the same aspect over and over and over again when they found only one copy of it. And so they decided to lean into the consequences of what you get from that. All of these aspects have different ranges they can roll on. Like, for example, if there's one that boosts your meteor spell, maybe one copy of it boosts it 25% and another copy 35%. Let's say it can roll somewhere between 20 and 40%. So you'd be caring about the specific rolls that you get. And you might even care about new copies that were rolled a little bit worse than your current copy, because these copies all get used up and you need lots of them. So they probably thought, hey, that keeps the long tail of the loot game alive and gives people, more things to be excited about dropping. That was probably the mentality. But let's look at the real consequences and see how incredibly awful this design decision was. Let's say you have your gloves with pretty decent stats and you've got the aspect that you want applied to it. Okay, great. And then a little bit later, better gloves drop, meaning they have better stats, but you don't have another copy of this aspect. So what do? We've got two choices. One is you can not wear the better stat gloves that you have. You have this better equipment, but you could just leave it in your inventory and not use it because you don't have the correct aspect to apply to it. If you choose that, that feels really bad. That's like the opposite of what the game is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about empowering your progression. But here you got some progression sort of, but then you can't use it. Yeah, awful. Your other choice is you can put on those new gloves with better stats and just not have the aspect anymore. Maybe you have some other different aspect laying around that you could apply to it, but the one that you wanted, you just don't have anymore. And maybe that really affects your build. That is also very unfun. To illustrate just how unfun that situation is, let's think about how that would apply to your regular abilities, the 6 active abilities that you have. You can change those abilities around however you want, but can you imagine if you set those 6 active abilities to be the ones that you wanted, and then 20 minutes later or something, you couldn't use one of them anymore? Oh, sorry, your stats went up. You've got to find another copy of that ability out in the world. That would be awful, and it doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't work that way, but that is how the legendary aspect system worked. I know I'm playing up how bad that particular part is, but that's nothing. We're barely even getting started in how bad the whole thing is. The next part is that, of course, you, the player, know about this possible feel-bad situation, so you're planning for it. In fact, a lot of Diablo 4, as it was played in those first 3 seasons, was specifically planning around this issue. So you don't want to be caught in a situation where you get the better piece of gear, but have no aspect to apply to it. So what do? You collect a lot of these aspects just in case. What I mean is when you get piles and piles of loot somewhere in there, there's going to be some other pair of gloves with terrible stats that happens to have another copy of that aspect that you want. So you're going to keep that and put it in your inventory. But also the same aspect, it can appear on other kinds of gear too. Maybe there's a axe or a ring that has the very same aspect. So then you put the axe and the ring in your inventory too. And these are kind of decoys. They look like gloves and axe and ring, but all of that is nonsense, useless. All of that is just information that you should ignore, because what really matters is the aspects that are attached to them, that those are copies of the thing that you want to put on your gloves later when you upgrade your gloves. Well, how many do you need? Just 1 or 2 extras? I mean, that's not nearly enough. You're going to be upgrading each of your pieces of equipment many, many times. Maybe 5 extras or 10 or something. I don't know, at least 5. At some point, you're going to feel like you have enough extra copies of this particular aspect, maybe, but then more of them might drop. And rather than clog up your inventory even more than it already is, you might decide, oh, you know what? I could get rid of some of my earlier ones I was saving that had a lower roll, because I've got a new one that has like a perfect roll or almost the highest roll it can get. That makes sense to do, but how do you actually do that logistically? So you've got to look through your inventory, which on console, there isn't even a way to sort it. So you've got to look through all of these different decoy items. Some of them are rings or axes or gloves or whatever. And somewhere in there are the ones that have the correct aspect, and they all have different roles, and you have to mouse over each one of them one by one to see what their roles are. And then maybe you can find a lower rolled one and get rid of that one, and then put the new higher rolled one in your inventory. And then from then on, only keep the higher rolled ones. Does that sound fun? Does that sound like something you want to do in a game? This isn't even a minor thing. It's something that becomes more and more of the game as you play. Even though that's bad, there's still a lot more. It gets worse. A moment ago, I was asking how many copies of a given aspect do you really need to clog up your inventory with? But what about this? Not just a given aspect. What about all the different ones? Because you've got one that affects your meteor spell, another one that affects your teleport or whatever. You have 10 or more slots of gear, each one of them needing a whole bunch of extra copies of these aspects laying around in your inventory. But even that doesn't capture how much junk you have to collect and sort through. What I've said so far only covers the aspects that you currently are using on your character. But in Diablo 4, you are expected to evolve your build over time, to change it as you go. There's a million reasons why you might want to evolve your build as you play. You might realize that one playstyle is just more fun to you than another, or one ability is more fun to you than another. Or you might have gear that boosts a certain type of ability, and so you want to go a little more in that direction and build more around that. But the point is, you wouldn't be collecting extra copies of just the aspects that you're currently using. There's a whole bunch of other ones that are sort of related to your build that you're not currently using, and you might want to go in this direction or that direction. So now you need to save a whole bunch of copies of all of those just in case you're going to need them. There's also an irony that some of these aspects are incredibly rare. And if you encounter some of those, then it's even more reason to hold on to them in your inventory, because if you ever really did need them, it's going to be hard to get them unless you saved them. And there's more. We're not done filling up your inventory with junk yet. What about if you want to play a completely different build, not an evolution of your current build? For example, maybe you're playing a druid that focuses on werewolf skills, but you've been eyeing the totally different druid build that's a human that uses lightning storm. The lightning storm druid needs a completely different set of aspects, and some of them are pretty rare and hard to come by. So maybe as you're playing your werewolf, you're saving a whole bunch of extra lightning druid aspects just in case you want to switch your build to that. Your inventory is already completely unmanageable at this point, but there's more. What if you want to make another character? There's 12 different character slots in Diablo 4. You can make 12 different characters and they all share the same inventory space. This is why I said in another video that if Blizzard were to multiply the amount of inventory space that players have by 10, it still wouldn't really be enough. That's how incredibly microscopic the inventory was. It was immediately obvious when Diablo 4 launched that there was not nearly enough inventory space. And Blizzard heard that and they kind of tried to add more. They added like a little bit more barely, but they revealed that there's a technical issue with that. The issue is that whenever you encounter other players in the world, it immediately has to load every single item in your stash, in your inventory, not just the items on your character, but every single item that every different player owns. And that feels like a crazy way to do it. Like maybe they shouldn't even have admitted that that's how it works, but whatever. There's like a technical reason they couldn't just multiply everyone's inventory by 10, even if they wanted. But suppose they had given everyone 10 times the inventory space or 20 times or unlimited inventory space. Then what would it be like to play the game? Well, it would be better. It wouldn't be as bad, okay? Because as it stood with a very limited inventory space, more and more of your time starts to become caring about which thing to keep once it's all full. And it starts to be awful to even think about like doing a new dungeon because you get a whole bunch of new items and then you'd have to sort through all of them. And what if you wanted to keep like 3 of them? Oh gosh, your inventory's full though. And you got to figure out which 3 to get rid of. It's just a slog. It was horrible. So that part would be improved because you would just add the 3 that you want to keep to the, million pieces of junk you have laying around and you'd move on. But it wouldn't actually make for a fun game because you'd still have to sort through it. In fact, it would be worse than ever because now you'd be sorting through 10 times as much junk. But again, there's more wrong than just that. There's basically 3 categories of wrongness going on here. The first has to do with not enough inventory in the first place, which I just talked about. The second has to do with even if you had all the inventory space in the world, it's just unfun to sort through that much junk with no good mechanism to sort through it. And it's logistically annoying and unfun to have to do. And then the third area of problem is that even if you had unlimited inventory, even if you hired some assistant who managed all that for you and you didn't have to worry about that part, it's still unfun anyway because it makes your build inflexible. It's bizarre how inflexible it really was, unless the thing that you want to change is one of your 6 active abilities. If you want to change those, you just bring up the talent tree, you click a few points off, you click a few different points on, and you're done. And you can do it easily, instantly. So if you want to change your build completely on the ability level, there's no problem at all. But if you want to change it even a little bit with these aspects, it's a huge problem. What if you want to try out a different build? What are you going to do? Imprint a whole new set of aspects over your current ones, deleting your current ones, and then seeing if you like the new build. And what if you don't? You want to go back? You've got to then have a whole other set of like hopefully perfect rolled aspects from your original build to put back on. No one's going to do that. That's way too costly just to try something out. So the whole system of Diablo 4 was saying, don't change things. Well, unless the thing you want to change is your 6 abilities. You want to change those, change them all you want, but don't change the rest of your build at all. I think there's an important lesson in game design that can be learned here. And it reminds me of something that happened in my own games in the game Pandante. I'm not going to go deep into how Pandante works, but just if you zoom out, there's a kind of similar thing where Diablo 4 made an assumption early on, and so did I in Pandante, and that resulted in consequences that ended up being pretty bad. So the correct thing to do is not apply band-aids to the badness. In the Diablo 4 case, that would be give everyone 10 times as much inventory. The more correct thing is to look at the root cause, to kind of roll back and see if you can change something fundamental so that you don't have the problems in the first place. In the case of Pandante, the issue is with the first edition of that game. In order to really make it work correctly, there were just kind of too many little extra rules here and there. And separately from that, there was kind of too many times when priority would pass back and forth between players and players would have a chance to do something that it really slowed down the flow of the game. It wasn't easy to address those issues in Pandante because things really had to be the way they were to work. So the right thing to do was to take a step back and look, is there a fundamental rule that we could change that would avoid all of these problems in the first place? The second edition of Pandante works really well and solves all of that, and you can get it at sirloingames.com. But back to Diablo 4, Season 4 also solves the problem that they had the same kind of way and in a fundamental way rather than a Band-Aid way. What they did was go back to that assumption of, well, we can't let you re-imprint an aspect over and over again because then you would run out of loot, and examine that. Is that really true? All the pieces of the solution were really floating right in front of their eyes too. There's a feature that it launched with called the Codex of Power, and that thing stores certain aspects, not all of them, just a subset of all of the special powers you can apply to gear are in this Codex of Power. You complete various dungeons in order to unlock more aspects in your Codex of Power. And the ones that are there, you can imprint them on gear over and over as much as you want. But the two caveats are, one, again, not all of the aspects in the game can ever be in the Codex. Only some of them can. And two, the ones that are there, they always are the worst roll possible. Like if it's between a 20 and 40% boost or something, the one in the Codex will only ever give the minimum 20% boost. I think the Codex of Power existing at all showed that Blizzard knew that you really needed some floor here, some minimum of like, at least you can have certain aspects to make your build functional. If we're to take a step back and question our earlier assumptions to see if we can avoid all of this, the first question should be, can all of the aspects go in the Codex of Power? And would it be okay if whatever roll that you got, like 20 to 40, let's say you got one that was 37%, if you could just permanently have a 37% roll in your Codex? I know that earlier we were against that because we were worried that you would run out of gear to care about, but is there some way that that could work? If the answer is yes, if that can work, it immediately erases pretty much all of the problems that I talked about, because it would mean you wouldn't need to save a whole bunch of extra copies of aspects. You wouldn't need to save any. There would be none, zero anywhere in your inventory. You would just get an aspect, you would extract it, and then instead of an inventory item, your Codex of Power is separate. It doesn't have an inventory. It would just list that you now have this thing permanently. So you wouldn't have to clog up your inventory. You wouldn't have to search through a bunch of decoy useless items to find the different stat rolls that you have, some of them low, some of them high. You wouldn't run out of space for multiple different characters. Everything would just be so much cleaner. You could spend so much more of your time actually fighting monsters instead of managing your inventory. As you played Diablo Season 1 through 3 more and more, a higher and higher percentage of your time is managing inventory it approaches, honestly, it feels like most of my time. So bam, all of that would be solved with this Codex of Power thing. So can it work? What the changes in Season 4 show is, yes, it can work. The patch notes for Season 4 are over 10,000 words long. They've changed a million things about the game, but it is mainly this one change to the Codex of Power that makes a massive difference on the feeling of playing the whole game. Why is it that in Diablo 4 Season 4, it is okay to let players extract something and then use it over and over forever, but it didn't seem like it was okay to the designers originally? Part of it is the framework that they already had in place. There already is such a thing as very powerful so-called unique items that you only really get later in the game. You do care about loot for a long time because you are chasing these very difficult to get unique items that exist totally outside of the system that I've talked about so far. And about the aspect abilities that we are talking about here, the ranges that they can roll increase over time. Like at earlier levels, a given one might roll somewhere between a 10% and 20% bonus, but that very same aspect later in the game might roll, 20 to 40% or something like that. What that means is that if very early you find a perfect roll, that doesn't mean that you don't care about that aspect dropping ever again for the entire rest of the game for hundreds of hours. It's not true, because later in the game, the entire range of what it can roll is going to be higher. I think that right there is enough to solve the entire problem. But in Season 4, they did go a little bit further with a few other features. Sometimes gear can roll with something called a greater affix, which is a mouthful of a name that just means that a given stat line is like a super version that's 150% as powerful as the normal maximum that it could ever roll. So you're always on the lookout for gear that might have one or more greater affixes on it, in addition to the part where over time, the ranges of the aspects are getting higher and higher. So you care about those too. There are a few more features in Season 4 that support this working, but the most important one is really just ensuring that aspects have higher and higher ranges that they can roll over time. So it's fine if you have infinite copies of the best one you've seen so far. Even though I think Blizzard should not have launched Diablo 4 with the aspects working the way they did, I do want to give them big thumbs up credit for reacting to the problem and having the courage to make such a big change, and also having the wisdom to not just do a surface level change, but to go a few steps back to a more fundamental level and fix the root cause of the problem, which is what I think they've done here. If you know any other games that have had a similar problem to this, or if you know of games that had some sort of huge problem where the developers needed to take a step back and fix things on a big fundamental level and it worked, then let us know in the comments below. And the great irony here is a big example of that is Diablo 3, but that's for another time.